During 2018, we've seen Europe becoming more and more problematic. We've all seen the ESMA restrictions, GDPR, and a lot of other factors that are making Europe less and less lucrative. Beyond that, we see Beijing also consistently tightening its grip on financial services, capital outflows, and so on. All this turns Australia into a very lucrative alternative, or maybe we can even define it as a safe haven. But as we're going to see next, it doesn't come cheap. So what we want to do in this panel is we want to examine the alternatives in the Apac region, and more specifically Australia as a jurisdiction of a lot of interest, as we're going to see now. So I'm going to allow the panelists to introduce themselves. Abe, let's start with you.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. My name is Abe Avner Ziv from ZotaPay, CEO of ZotaPay, a payment gateway provider hub. We've witnessed recently major issues, whether it's in China itself or in Europe, due to the PSD2. I would say that currently today, that ASIC and Australia is much more attractive than Europe, and we will discuss it later on. The reasons for that, as from leverage and marketing purposes. But also we can see many brokers in Australia that trying to approach other markets rather than the Australian market, for example, the Chinese market. And here we come, it becomes a little bit more interesting how ASIC can or not regulate this activity with the local Chinese market. What are their tools in case a broker is not meet the standards or not using the same standards that they have locally in Australia, in China or Southeast Asia. And here we have a conflict that I don't think has been dealt yet. So I let my colleagues here to lead the speak, but later on we'll come back to that.
Hi everyone, my name's Paul. I'm from a law firm in Australia called Holly Nethercote. We have about 33 people in Melbourne and Sydney. About a third of our fee-earning staff came from ASIC, about a third came from top-tier firms, and about a third sort of went through the ranks. So we do a lot of licensing. I think we've got 30 licenses on the go at the moment, maybe 5 market maker licenses. So Australia is open for business. The standard is very high, and I guess I'll talk a little bit about that as one of the issues that we're raising in the panel today. The other thing that we'll be talking about, obviously, is the payments aspect. And so we're currently, some of you who know us, we've done this before, but we're crowdfunding advice from 14 countries about what you can and cannot do, because a lot of the PSPs are requiring legal advice now to show that the payment methods and processes are acceptable under local jurisdictions. So happy to talk about that later as well, but they're sort of the two issues that I'll be commenting on.
My name is Eugenio Congiagiuoco from Apac Management Consultancy. I help international brokers to enter China or to grow in China, and I help both Chinese and international clients with the licensing and M&A in financial services and fintech industry. So my notes will be mostly about the Chinese market. Then, of course, I will answer specific questions from Michael. Thank you.
Good morning, my name is Marcus Fong. I'm CEO of the Hong Kong entity of Invest Global. We are originally a Sydney-based non-bank prime broker. We do offer multi-asset liquidity to retail brokers around the world, including some asset managers and hedge funds around the world. In this panel, with some further discussion with my colleagues here on the stage, I will explain a little more on the impact from what we see from our retail brokers, the impact on the regulation changes, the impact on the leverage cuts, and also the license requirement changes recently. Thank you.
Thank you. So Marcus, let's continue with you. You know, in the research that we conducted recently, we found that we actually saw that in the numbers that Australian brokers did better than their European colleagues. So my question is, do you think that this trend will continue in 2019, or will we see some changes in that?
As a prime broker, we do see a difference in turnover in our client bases between European clients and Australian-based clients. We do see some of our Australian clients, retail broker clients, are doing very well in the last 2 quarters in 2018. We do expect this trend will continue in 2019 because we do think the leverage cut in ESMA and SciSec and some time ago in Turkey will definitely impact retail clients' preference when they choose a broker. Australian, we do not think there will be any further regulations on leverage in short term. So I think the trend will continue in 2019, maybe 2020, 21, something. But also we cannot expect ASIC to not do anything in very short term. But let's see. In 2019, we do think it will continue.
Okay, Paul, let's continue with you with the same question, but I want to focus it better on what Marcus just said about what do we expect to see from ASIC in 2019.
Sure. So there's a number of factors that affect how we think ASIC is going to be this year. Naturally, volumes are up. ASIC can see all the derivative trade reporting data coming through, so they can see that, they know that. There's been a Royal Commission in Australia, and the final recommendation, the final report is coming out very soon. And the response already to that Royal Commission has been that ASIC is far more litigious, far tougher, and so we're expecting that to be across all industries, including the forex broking industry. So we think it's going to be the regulator's going to be a lot tougher. And they know that the volumes are going up. We agree, in the short term, restrictions on leverage are unlikely. There are design and distribution and product intervention laws currently tabled before Parliament. There's also an election coming up. We don't know if it'll get through. We suspect it will. Even if it does, there are time periods given to brokers or to the whole industry to basically meet requirements like coming up with an appropriateness test for customers. And then as a last resort, the regulator, ASIC, will have some powers to restrict how products are offered, and that may include restrictions on leverage. There's a bit of a trend, and there's some IOSCO reports that sort of, thank you, there's an IOSCO report that summarises what's happening in a bunch of different countries. And so we suspect eventually ASIC will follow that trend around restrictions and other types of things, but I think that's a fair way down the track. I doubt that's going to happen in 2019. In theory, it could happen in some ways, but we doubt it.
A sigh of relief from our audience.
Yeah, well, short term, yeah.
Is it?
I don't know. You tell me.
I don't know any broker that would, a serious broker that would start his business on a short term. Obviously, for sure, the short term it will be beneficial for them, but any serious business would think about the long term. Definitely, we can see that European licenses become much less attractive for the brokers themselves. It was already a competitive market with very low spreads to almost everyone. And right now, for you to understand, any broker, compare yourself, you have a kiosk or supermarket in your neighborhood, and suddenly all your products raising in 60% more. Same people, same neighborhood, same money, but all your products cost 60% more. This is what it means, PSD2 and ESMA2 and leverage limitation for the brokers in Europe. Nevertheless, marketing-wise, you can see today there are many affiliates with no jobs. They can push traffic, but there is no one to accept it in Europe at least. And the requirements, the registration for a new user, for him is filling in fields, more than, 100 fields, questionnaire, let alone the professional traders. They need to fill in a questionnaire. So it makes the acquisition, from a marketing point of view, also not profitable for the merchants, for the brokers. And no doubt that you can see any big group which holds a couple of licenses, whether it's European-based, offshore-based, ASIC-based, would push their traffic from the European licenses toward either the offshore or ASIC due to these requirements and limitations. So from one hand, their businesses, they're like FX brokers in Europe, it's much tougher for them in a market that was already tough. So I think most of them has no other way but to move, shift the traffic, or at least target other regions outside of Europe, because the European market become not competitive and maybe not able to work in the near-time future.
So, picking up from what you just said, 2 points. One would be the will to move to new markets and Australia especially, and the second one is costs. And
Correct.
I want to divert this question to Paul. We just spoke recently, and we recently assessed the entrance to the ASIC market, to the ASIC license, by $4 million. So you contested this assessment, but I want to ask you, is it really that expensive, and what does this price include?
Sure. So $4 million is a rough price that some businesses have been sold for that have a market-making license and that are dormant, that I've heard about. We haven't been involved in those transactions. The transactions we've been involved in where a market maker has been sold in Australia, the price somewhere between 2 and 10 million. There's been a couple of them, and Eugenio's worked on one of them with us. There's a revenue trail that can go towards the valuation. We warn clients if they're buying a licensee that's been dormant. ASIC has a tendency to try and suspend those licenses when they receive the change of control notice. We've seen that happen a couple of times, and we once represented someone and had that suspension lifted, but only after the buyer was willing to show they had the resources to really run this thing. So we say that's pretty risky. The cost of getting one from scratch, we're normally quoting at the moment around $100,000. So it's a lot cheaper. It takes that's 50 grand for the license application, and so our head of licensing previously oversaw ASIC's team of licensing for 15 years, so really knows his stuff, but it's still really hard. So it's 50 grand to get the license and about 50 grand for all the legal documents, and so that's actually not very expensive relative to buying a brokerage. But if you get one from scratch, the real cost is time, because you've got to line up really good people, and then you've got to sort of keep them locked in until you get your license. And we're telling people 12 to 18 months. You might have to appeal it. You know, the current regulatory environment is so tough. You've got to give yourself a bit of time. And so once you factor that in, the real cost is that keeping good people tied in. And so we would say there's 3 things to get your own. Time, 12 to 18 months. Talent, you've got to have good, responsible managers and directors that have problem-free experience and experience working with a regulated broker. And then you have to have, I'm trying to make it 3 T's, but you've got to keep it thorough, right? You've got to be really, really thorough. And so ASIC wants to see that you're basically ready to go. They're going to be questioning whether you're just trying to sort of regulatory arbitrage the global market by, you know, picking up European customers.
Particularly if you're from China.
Yeah, that's right. Yes. They want to know all about your overseas activities. They have limited jurisdiction about that, but they want to know that you're doing the right thing, that you're providing your services fairly and honestly. That's a big phrase in Australia at the moment. What is fair? What is honest? And ASIC actually has some legal powers. If they feel like someone's not being fair or honest, or if they reasonably expect someone's not going to comply with the law, they can make life very difficult for people. So it can be done. They're the costs. 2 options. One takes a long time. Obviously, an M&A deal is a lot quicker, and sometimes we've done them relatively quickly.
Okay, so following that and taking us back to what Abe said in the beginning about Australian brokers trying to enter the Chinese market. So, Eugenio, you were quiet until now. Let me ask you, do you really see this trend happening of Australian brokers trying to enter the Chinese market? And a follow-up question now, with the good turnover of this year, maybe they will start doing this in 2019. What do you think?
Okay, so let's say there are 2 reasons why Australian companies, Australian brokers might want to enter China. One is because they are expanding globally, and this is going to happen because right now Australia is the hottest jurisdiction in terms of tier 1, tier 2 jurisdiction in the world because it has not implemented yet the restrictions that are present elsewhere. It enjoys a very good reputation within Apac area, and they had very good numbers, which means they have more liquidity on their balance sheet that they can use in order to further expand. So I think we are going to see Australian brokers to become even more global, to enter not only China but also other markets which are becoming hot, like from South Africa to Nigeria to South America in the future. So we can see some trends that before we were seeing from US in our previous life, and in UK recently. I think we will see it from Australia. Of course, there might be some limitations in the sense that the Australian government, the regulator, might require the brokers to prove in some way that they are allowed to onboard clients from China or from other jurisdictions, in the same way as Cyprus has been pushing some in the past. So actually, this is also a question for Paul. Is this a common issue for the Australian brokers to? Do they have to prove to the regulator that they are able to onboard clients from China, even though there is no specific regulation there?
We've specifically dealt with ASIC on that question, and representing the brokers, we've said in that particular example, well, our broker actually got legal advice. It was part of our last crowdfunding project. We got advice from China about what they could and could not do. And as you know, with most jurisdictions, there are some rules, and then the law is silent on certain activities, and so it's not always a straightforward question. And so basically, we said to us, with our client, we said they've had legal advice and they've taken steps to comply with as best they can with that advice. And then ASIC said, we'd like to see that advice, and which we said, well, our client wasn't willing to share that with ASIC, and so that was sort of where the conversation finished. They didn't follow it up. I think ASIC just wants to know that the brokers are taking reasonable steps to do the right thing in those jurisdictions, and it's very difficult because it's a lot of these Asian jurisdictions have very ambiguous laws, and so all we can tell people to do is to take reasonable steps. Look, one reasonable step is to get advice, and then to actually follow what that advice does as best as possible. Yeah.
So
anyway, to finish my question, so there was the second part to it, which is of course, then there are some brokers in Australia which are already owned by Chinese or Hongkong entrepreneurs. So of course, that is they are going to do business with China. But it is very, very important that any new applicant or someone who wants to carry out an M&A transaction with Australia and he's from Hong Kong or China, they have to prove to the authorities that they're not just buying the license for the sake of having a license, like we'll say, a license arbitrage, and they need to have, they need to show a real business plan where they intend to develop a business in Australia, have a very strong team. So that is where some companies failed in the past. I remember a few years back there was the case of Formax, that they bought a license in Australia, and then basically they just lost it because they could not meet their requirements.
Marcus, same question. Very shortly, do you see this appetite of Australian brokers to enter China?
Yes, we do see. We see many of our Australian broker clients have their names in Shanghai Expos. They have booths there. So we do see the trend. It's been already a few years. It's been already a few years for that. And I want to add a few points in addition to Eugenio's what was just explained. There are a lot of difficulties when you apply for a license in Australia, but things are getting more difficult after you have got the license, because you're still able to onboard offshore clients. That means clients outside Australia. But we do see from history that it's not always true. But once you got many years ago, Australian brokers were able to onboard Japanese retail client, but it has been prohibited since a few years ago. We do see at that moment one of the biggest Australian broker who has got roughly 30 to 40% exposure to Japanese retail clients just simply lost their business. So this is another risk you have to, a retail broker need to think about that once they, not only the application of a license, but things after that.
So
I think, if I can add, I think this issue with Japan is is common also with so there are some countries like Japan, Canada, even Singapore, where I am based. that they are very active in trying to stop other countries from acquiring their clients, particularly if they are actively soliciting. So usually what they do is, the first thing they do, they pick up the phone and they call the authority where the broker is from to say, get these guys to stop. I think US, Canada, Japan and Singapore are the most active in this. In fact, some restrictions that were entered in Cyprus last year were that was the source of it, that the SISEC got calls from the Japan authority all the time.
Okay. So, Abe, I want to ask you, we talked about China. So, during 2018, we reported quite a few crackdowns, both from the government and from local authorities. And the notion is that China is becoming more and more problematic. But then again, we hear also different trends about more and more people entering China quietly, more and more brokers doing activity there. So can you settle this discussion? What can you say about Chinese activity right now?
Yeah, definitely. And before I have some comments about my colleagues, what they said. And I would say it's very nice, with all due respect to the ASIC or other regulators, they are responsible for what's going on in their region. However, it's not how the Chinese government see the same things. So, as in the eyes of the Chinese or the Chinese authorities, currently, today, FX is prohibited. If we were in a gray zone industry maybe a year ago and a couple of years ago, and we could say gambling is prohibited and FX maybe is a gray zone industry, on 2018 we saw totally differently. FX is much more difficult today than gambling. And you know how the Chinese authorities are against gambling. So we are in a very bad position today from their point of view. They will do almost anything to stop proactively foreign brokers from conducting businesses in China. We heard stories about brokers that have been invited. I think you already wrote a couple of articles about it. Foreign brokers, been invited for investigation or to answer some questions in front of the authorities. And in the end of the day, we see a lot of banking issues. If we had maybe 20 providers a year and a half ago, that are doing FX, today none of them officially is doing FX. None of them, in fact, is willing to do a processing for FX, and the traditional Union Pay and Alipay methods are no longer available for FX brokers. And even if you do have, you find here and there are a lot of problems coming from the end users. I would call it epidemic, from end users that are maliciously complained on a broker, even if it's not true, even if they want money just for the sake of it, or in order to blackmail the broker, and until they do not resolve the complaint, officially sending a letter to their bank with a cancellation letter, they will not, the account will be frozen. All the funds that has been processed there in the past day or two will be blocked. And in some cases, we've witnessed at least two of DinPay and Baofu, which were the strongest FX processor PSPs. Currently today, their licenses are revoked. So also license revoked, and Chinese are taking their licenses, the PSP, and today from 300 we see only 100 left with licenses, and none of them is willing to take the risk for FX. So you need to be very creative in terms of solutions, and we see a new type of payment solution came into the world under the name of P2P. It's a local payment transfer from person to person.
Let me stop you there because I want to give Eugenio the chance to follow up on that question. Do you share this doom and gloom forecast? That,
Well,
Dave just gave?
I share most of what he said because, of course, we are on the same.
Also, what advice can you give to brokers who want to work in China, given that situation right now?
Yeah. So all of my clients, which are brokers operating in China, are facing this problem. So in the last, let's say, 2 years, let's say the brokers have been facing more challenges in China, particularly three. One has been about payments. Second one has been about direct lead generation because of the bans introduced by Baidu, the main search engine. And the third one is this problem of the blackmailing that he mentioned, because before this blackmailing was only happening when the broker was not treating fairly the client or was doing some screw up. Actually, all this, unfortunately, I must say, started with the binary option brokers operating in China, because there were, without making names, but everyone knows in the industry, there was one in particular that messed up quite badly in China, and that is where the trend of blackmailing started. And now, instead, we are at the point where many clients and IBs know how fragile the regulatory framework of a broker in China is, so they use this even when they just lost, because they just lost money, that the broker didn't do anything wrong at all. They just go there, okay, I want part of my money back, otherwise I'm going to go to the authorities. If the broker does not know how to deal with that, then that is a problem, because it's not just about the economic problem with the single client, but it's the fact that once they complain, their account might be frozen. So maybe for a 1,000 RMB dispute, they have 5 million RMB, under ransom, for, under hostage. Because of this problem. So this is a problem. About the payment service provider, usually the advice that I give to the broker is just to try to sign up with as many providers as possible, because there might be some kind of intermittent service. It is not fault or only fault of the PSP, because it's a long chain to get funds from China in a certain way. So if any part of this blocks under the way, that particular processor might be suspended for a month or more. And in the meantime, if you have a backup solution, at least your business does not stop. But there is a huge problem that I see my clients are willing to take too much risk right now, in the sense that they are so desperate to process the funds out of China that they go to some payment service provider which do not have any regulation or control at all.
I will have to stop you at this point. Before we wrap up and move to the questions above us, I want to very briefly to ask all of you, what should we expect in 2019 in terms of the Apac region for brokers, for prime brokers, and what advice would you give to brokers and other entities in the ecosystem in order to prepare for this year? So, Marcus, let's start with you.
In 2019, I think the key to relieve all those regulations concern is to offer to diversify your product offering to the retail clients. You can't avoid all the regulation changes. You don't have any control on that, but you can control on your product offering. We do believe that offering, in addition to FX, metals, single stocks, stock indices, the multi-asset offering to the retail client is the key to relieve those concerns. You can go to Australia, you can go to ESMA, you can find a different jurisdiction to register your company, to find a different license, but that can't solve all your problems. As a non-bank prime broker, we do facilitate our clients. We do support our retail broker clients to diversify their product offering. So I think in addition to find a proper jurisdiction to register your license, offer multi-asset is the key to success.
Eugenio?
Yeah, I mean, from China point of view, even though there are all these restrictions, I still see some opportunities. First of all, I think it's important to say that we work with both, let's say, medium and medium-small and larger brokers. So in general, we see that our medium and small brokers are kind of struggling this year, but our larger clients are still doing pretty well, I must say, without making numbers, but they're still doing well. So as long as you have the proper management in China who know how to, solve the problem with this blackmailing, with the payment, acquiring IBs and so on, and this good GM have, let's say, have a price in terms of budget. So larger companies will still do well in China. Other opportunities in China are maybe from M&A, because we start seeing some little steps. I will not go in detail now because we have no time in this, but so there have been some deals in the market we know a very large brokerage house that now is, I think, 52% owned by a Chinese entity. So they might stand one step ahead towards the other. So there might be something there happening, because there was a law passed some time back in China where now even financial services company can be owned for more than 51% by foreign investors. But this is only a large scale. In terms of other markets, as I mentioned earlier, I think South Africa, Nigeria, and South America are other interesting countries for my clients.
Okay, Paul?
Okay, so I agree with what Marcus said. We've helped a few people add equities to their license already in the last year and a half because of the changes that are happening, so diversifying that way. Also, we act for a lot of crypto exchanges. It takes a couple of weeks to register a crypto exchange in Australia. That's one way to start operating in Australia with that service offering, and it's much easier to do. The main suggestion we would make is, as lawyers, is just to know what your legal obligations are in other countries. So if you want to know more, I can talk to you afterwards about if you want to be part of the crowdfunding for 14 different countries. The other thing is we've got training that we're running here tomorrow. If you want to know what your obligations are under an AFSL, you can talk to me about that. So just being proactive, so knowing what's coming up. And also part of being proactive is saying, how can we start looking at whether our products are actually appropriate for our customers? Because this appropriateness requirement is going to be coming in Australia. And so maybe if they're over the age of 80, maybe if they're mentally disabled, maybe if they're using their pension fund, maybe we just don't allow them to open an account. Most of you already have rules like that, but actually pushing in that direction. So that's sort of some things to think about. Could go on, but...
Okay. Abe, this question is relevant for you, so maybe we could just connect this to your summary. So how does ASIC or China view payments in crypto? Is it AML compliant? Is it a good way to avoid credit card problems, I guess?
So you have time for another session now? So just to wrap up.
You have a session now, that's why we're in a hurry.
Just to wrap up and clarify something, before we talked about the legal opinion for brokers requirement for each and every country. I just wanted to make sure that clarification that Visa and MasterCard, mainly Visa, now has issued a new article that the acquirers must have a legal opinion from every local country that their broker wants to operate in. So it's not a regulator requirement more than a Visa and a PSP acquirer point of view of requirements.
And that's why we're doing this crowdfunding is actually Visa, MasterCard, and also Google and Apple in their stores.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So from regulator point of view, it's not required. However, Visa and MasterCard. Now, we were speaking about China. Obviously, there is no real lawyer that will issue a letter of legal opinion that a foreign broker can do it today. But again, there is no requirement because it's not Visa and MasterCard. There is no distribution for that. So the Chinese are working a little bit differently, and that's why we can see here no legal opinions, but still ASIC regulators, and this combination still exists today. And none of them, not the ASIC or the Chinese, know exactly what to do because of that, and it still exists. In terms of my recommendation, is in terms of marketing, I would say that the Forex brokers which are regulated needs to speak about FTDR, meaning FTD that came and has been verified to the regulator, completed all the fields, and the new affiliate, as I see it, needs to provide the FTD, including all the information inside, like in the onboarding process and the requirements. Now, in terms of payments and crypto. We saw a few months ago that China prohibited the cryptocurrency activity. In the end of the day, they wanted to regulate it, and something they cannot regulate, they stop. Whoever knows and read the inside of the FC here in Hong Kong, we witnessed a few weeks ago a sandbox has been created. This sandbox is an exchange ruled by the government, the Hong Kong government. At least this is what they want to do. And any exchange that want to have a license in Hong Kong will be connected to this sandbox. And that's the way of the Chinese or Hong Kong, from one hand, not to ignore the cryptocurrency market, and from the other hand, to test it, but still control it. And if you ask me, someone who already know China for more than a decade, I live there, I speak Mandarin, this is the first step towards Chinese blockchain, Chinese currency, the same as you have WeChat and WhatsApp, and Shenzhen and Facebook, or I think personally this is the first step. You would see 3 or 4 years from now, Chinese cryptocurrency, even blockchain by their own, controlled and centralized but decentralized by the Chinese.
Crypto in China is a totally separate discussion, and we indeed will need another session for that. John?
Okay, if you have very concise tidbits about the second question, we have a few more minutes, and then we will wrap up. So we're being asked if smaller APEC markets, which we haven't quite touched upon, such as Malaysia and Thailand, look at ASIC, for example. If we look at, I think what we try to ask is how will regulation look like in these regions in 5 years from now? Will it be more stringent like the FCA or ASIC, or is it something like other regulators using their capacity to draw in the industry?
Well, just some of the advices that I have seen starting to trickle in. We know Thailand's introducing some new laws, but there is this IOSCO, this International Organisation of Securities Commissions, that most of the most regulators from countries are signatories. Well, they're part of that. And so there's a mandate there to increase, to try to have matching levels of regulation, because globally regulatory arbitrage is not seen as a good thing by any government. So that's the intention. But with the changes in Thailand, my understanding is it hasn't actually made anything easier for brokers. So I don't know enough to really properly answer that question, but that's just a little bit of an observation to add to the conversation.
If you don't know enough, apparently it's not yet known at all.
We could get a Thai lawyer here on the panel, but yeah.
Sure.
Next time.
Okay, so thank you very much. Give a round of applause to our attendees. I think we all learned a lot about how the future may look like.